Sierra Nevada, California, January 14th, 1883. 6 hours and 47 minutes past midnight. The mercury in the glass thermometer hanging on Silas Merrick's porch read 8 degrees below zero. Wind howled down from the granite peaks at 70 miles per hour, carrying ice crystals that struck exposed skin like thrown sand. Snow had piled 11 feet against the north walls of the settlement's cabins, through the night sculpted into sharp ridges by gusts that shook pine timber frames and sent tremors through stone chimneys. Inside Merrick's 16 by 12-foot cabin, built with 4 exposed log walls, according to standard frontier practice, the fire in the cast iron stove had burned continuously for 18 hours. His wife Ingrid had woken every 2 hours through the night to feed split pine into flames that consumed wood faster than any man could cut it. The room held steady at 14 degrees Fahrenheit. Breath hung visible in the air. Water buckets sat frozen solid 30 inches from the hearth. Ice formed half an inch thick on the interior log faces, crystals catching lantern light like scattered diamonds. Their son Anders, 8 years old, lay wrapped in 3 wool blankets on a pallet near the stove. His lips carried the blue-purple tinge that every parent on the frontier learned to fear. 180 yards to the west, in a cabin measuring 14 feet by 18, the cast iron stove had been cold for 5 hours and 23 minutes. No smoke rose from its chimney. The structure sat dark and silent in the pre-dawn darkness. Inside, the temperature held steady at 44 degrees Fahrenheit. 11 people breathed easy in that space. Children slept without coats. The north wall radiated heat to the bare palm like banked coals, though no fire had touched it for hours. The woman who built that cabin sat awake in a wooden chair, recording numbers by lantern light in a journal she had kept for 28 months. Outside temperature negative 12 degrees. Inside temperature 44 degrees. Fire extinguished 5 hours, 23 minutes prior. Stone wall warm to touch. 11 souls safe. Her name was Karen Johansson. She was 36 years old. 3 years earlier, the men of this settlement had called her a fool. Now, their children slept warm in the shelter those same men had mocked. This is the documented account of how one Norwegian widow's knowledge of thermal mass saved lives in the Sierra Nevada winter of 1883. Karen had arrived in California in July of 1880, one among nearly 1 million Norwegians who immigrated to America between 1820 and 1920. She carried $240 in savings, a surveyor's claim to virgin timberland, and memories of construction methods learned in the Telemark region where winter lasted half the year and stone walls 18 inches thick kept livestock and people alive through months of killing cold. She was a widow. Her husband Eric had died 14 months earlier in a mining accident 300 miles south, crushed between ore cart and tunnel wall, in darkness, 200 feet underground. They had been married 11 years. They had not had children. She had sold their small house, taken her savings, and moved north to claim land under the Homestead Act. Her father had been a stonemason in Norway. He had built houses that combined massive timber framing with stone walls that absorbed heat from cooking fires and radiated it back through long Arctic nights. He had taught her that rock was not an obstacle, but a resource. Stone heats slowly. Stone cools slowly. Stone acts as a thermal bank that smooths temperature swings when properly integrated into building design. She had watched him work for 20 years before his death from pneumonia, when she was 31. On his final day, lucid despite fever, he had gripped her hand and whispered, "Stone remembers warmth, Karen. When fire forgets, stone remembers." When she walked her newly claimed land in late July of 1880, she found what others might have considered misfortune. A house-sized granite boulder occupied the center of the most level clearing. The rock stood 20 feet high, 30 feet long, perhaps 10 to 12 feet thick. Its face angled slightly south and southeast, positioned to catch morning and midday sun. Karen saw thermal mass. She saw a north wall that would never rot. She saw 80,000 pounds of granite that could absorb heat during the day and release it through the night. She saw her father's teachings made manifest in American stone. She staked her cabin boundaries so the boulder would form her entire north wall. The settlement noticed immediately. Silas Merrick noticed first. He was 43 years old, owner of the valley's only sawmill. A man who had survived 23 winters in various territories. He stopped by Karen's claim on a September morning, found her measuring distances with rope, sketching plans in a journal. "Miss Johansson," he said, removing his hat, "that boulder presents a challenge. It presents an opportunity." He studied her stakes. He walked the perimeter. His expression shifted from curiosity to concern. "You're planning to build against the stone." "I am." "That will fail." His voice carried no malice, only the authority of experience. "Stone sweats moisture when temperature changes. Condensation will rot your floor joists in 2 seasons. You'll burn twice the fuel to maintain half the warmth, because rock conducts heat straight to outside air." Karen met his eyes with calm directness. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Merrick. I will proceed carefully." He replaced his hat and rode back toward his mill, shaking his head. 3 days later, Beatrice Harland stopped by while hauling supplies up the mountain trail. She was 41 years old, a freight hauler who had learned to drive 6-horse teams after her husband died of fever in 1878. She had built 3 cabins herself. She stood in Karen's clearing and spoke bluntly. "You're making a mistake. Stone doesn't insulate. It conducts. Every degree of heat you build inside transfers straight through that rock to outside air. My daughter and I nearly died our first winter because I built the chimney on the windward side. Learn from others' mistakes." Again, Karen heard genuine concern. "I appreciate your experience, Miss Harland. I will work according to what I know." Beatrice climbed onto her wagon seat. "Winters here kill the unprepared. I hope you know what you're doing." The settlement's assessment formed quickly. The Norwegian widow was building wrong, too stubborn to follow proven methods. She would learn the hard way. No one offered to help. Karen worked alone. September 15th, 1880. She began felling timber. Standard cabin construction required approximately 70 logs for a 16 by 12-foot structure. Karen's design called for 52 logs, 3 walls only. The boulder would serve as her north barrier. She selected ponderosa pine, between 8 and 10 inches in diameter. She worked with a crosscut saw, making cuts alone that normally required 2 people. Each tree took between 45 minutes and an hour. She averaged 3 logs per day, working from dawn until darkness made further labor dangerous. By October 5th, her neighbors had finished their cabins. They had worked in teams, raising 4-wall structures in 3 weeks. Karen was still selecting logs, still trimming bark, still working alone, while autumn cold descended. The settlement noticed others who prepared differently. Ezra Thornton, a bachelor miner, had built a crude shack half a mile north of the main settlement. His structure measured barely 10 by 10 feet, constructed more like a storage shed than proper dwelling, with gaps in the chinking wide enough to see daylight through. He worked his claim obsessively and kept to himself. Widow Brennan and her 3 children, 2 daughters, aged 7 and 9, a son, aged 11, lived in a small cabin near the Southern Trail. Her late husband had built it before fever claimed him in 1879. The structure followed standard practice, but showed signs of hasty construction, loose chinking, shallow roof pitch. The widow struggled to maintain it alone while caring for children and managing a small plot. Both families operated on the margins of settlement life. Both would face the coming winter with inadequate preparation. But in October of 1880, the community's attention focused on the Norwegian woman building 3 walls against a boulder everyone else would have cleared. On October 20th, Reverend Nathaniel Hale called a community meeting. 16 adults attended. The topic was winter preparation and mutual aid. Hale was 55 years old, a circuit preacher who had buried children who froze. He raised the question everyone had been considering privately. What would the community do when Miss Johansson's cabin proved inadequate and she required rescue in January or February? Silas Merrick spoke first, explaining his concern as practical economics. His sawmill depended on steady business. If the 3-wall design proved successful and others copied it, he would lose 20 logs of revenue per cabin. But beyond personal interest, he genuinely believed the design would fail. Stone conducted heat. Everyone knew this. The widow would burn through her fuel supply, and when her wood ran out, she would need help that would tax everyone's reserves. Beatrice Harland added her experience. Inadequate shelter killed. She had nearly lost her daughter their first winter. She could not offer resources she barely had. Others voiced similar concerns. Not cruelty, simply the harsh arithmetic of frontier survival, where every cord of firewood carried consequences. Reverend Hale proposed they approach Miss Johansson together, offer to help her modify the design, add a 4th wall before snow made construction impossible. The next morning, October 21st, 5 members of the community walked to Karen's claim. They found her fitting logs to the boulder face, trimming inner surfaces, to sit within 2 inches of the rock stuffing gaps with sheep wool. Reverend Hale explained their offer. Help her build correctly, add the north wall, ensure her survival. Karen set down her draw knife. She looked at each person in turn, meeting their eyes with calm directness. I thank you for coming. I will build as I have planned. Miss Johansson, Silas Merrick said, we have decades of experience among us. So did my father. For 40 years, he built with stone in Norway. I trust his knowledge. This isn't Norway, Beatrice said firmly. Different place, different rules. Stone is stone. Heat is heat. Physics does not change with geography. They tried for 20 minutes. Karen listened politely. She did not argue. She simply returned to work. The delegation left. That evening, the settlement's judgment solidified. The widow was stubborn, too proud to accept help. She would learn through suffering. October 28th brought the first snow. 2 feet overnight. Temperatures dropped into the teens. Karen worked anyway. She built a small fire each morning to warm her hands. She cleared snow from her workspace. She continued fitting logs, course by course, 7 levels high. She installed the roof system, positioning 2x6 rafters at 24-inch spacing, creating a 12 to 12 pitch designed to shed snow rather than support its weight. By November 12th, she had worked for 10 weeks. Her cabin stood complete. 3 walls of saddle-notched pine logs, chinked with moss, clay, and lime mortar. 1 wall of house-sized granite boulder. A roof pitched steep enough to handle Sierra snowfall. A door on the south face. 2 small windows positioned to capture morning light. Inside, against the boulder's inner face, positioned 36 inches from the stone, she installed a small cast-iron stove with an 18-inch firebox. The stovepipe rose through a masonry chimney section, built so part of the flue made direct contact with the granite, ensuring heat transfer during burning hours. Directly against the boulder, she constructed a stone bench, 18 inches deep, 16 inches high, 8 feet long, flat rocks fitted tight to create a surface that would absorb heat from the stove's radiant output. On November 5th, she tested the system. She loaded the stove at 7 in the evening. She burned split pine hot for 3 hours. At 10:15, with outside temperature at 22 degrees, she banked the fire to coals and closed the damper. At 6:20 the next morning, she recorded measurements. The stove was cold, 8 hours without fuel. Outside, temperature had dropped to 18 degrees. Inside temperature measured 39 degrees by the door, 42 degrees at the stone bench. She placed her bare palm against the boulder's interior face. The rock felt warm, heat stored during evening burning hours, radiating back into the living space. 21 degrees of differential maintained through the coldest hours with 0 fuel consumption. She wrote these numbers in her journal. She dated the entry. She added a single line. Father's teachings confirmed. Stone remembers warmth. She moved her possessions into the cabin that afternoon. She stacked 4 cords of firewood under a shelter against the east wall. She prepared for winter with quiet confidence born from tested knowledge. Her neighbors watched smoke rise from her chimney on cold November evenings. They noticed the smoke stopped rising by 10 or 11 each night. They shook their heads at the foolishness of letting fires die during freezing weather. They waited for her to learn the hard way. They prepared their own shelters, stacking 6 and 7 cords of firewood, checking, chinking, reinforcing roofs. Silas Merrick stood on his porch one November evening, watching the last light fade from Karen's chimney by 9:45. He turned to his wife Ingrid. She'll come asking for help by January. Mark my words. Ingrid glanced toward the widow's dark cabin, barely visible through evening snow. Perhaps, or perhaps she knows something we don't. Stone is stone, Ingrid. It pulls heat away. That's simple fact. But Ingrid said nothing more. Women talked among themselves, and she had heard things. The widow's cabin stayed noticeably warmer during the brief visits other women made, under pretense of checking on the Norwegians' welfare. The air inside felt different, less biting, more stable. Ingrid kept these observations to herself. Her husband's sawmill provided their income. Challenging his expertise on construction served no purpose. Outside, the first real storms of winter approached from the north. In her 3-walled cabin, Karen Johansson sat recording temperatures, burning minimal fuel, sleeping warm on a stone bench that held heat like a promise kept. The test was coming. She was ready, and half a mile north, in a shack with gaps in the walls, Ezra Thornton stoked a fire that would burn through the night and still leave him shivering by dawn. He had no idea that within 3 months, His inadequate shelter would drive him into the arms of people who had barely acknowledged his existence. The winter of 1880 was only beginning. December brought cold that settled into the bones of the Sierra Nevada like a permanent resident. Temperatures dropped to 15 degrees most nights, occasionally reaching single digits when high-pressure systems cleared the sky to reveal stars so bright they seemed to vibrate in frozen air. Snow accumulated in steady deposits, 2 to 3 feet at a time, building drifts that reached 6 and 7 feet by month's end. The settlement burned wood at rates that consumed reserves faster than anticipated. Stoves required feeding every 2 to 3 hours. Men spent daylight hours cutting additional fuel, traveling farther from homes as nearby deadfall disappeared. Women woke multiple times each night to add split pine to fires that could not be allowed to die. Karen Johansson's chimney produced smoke for approximately 6 hours each evening. Then it stopped. Her neighbors noticed. She must be rationing fuel to dangerous levels, too stubborn to ask for help. On December 18, 1880, Karen recorded data that contradicted every assumption. She had established a routine that varied little. At 7 in the evening, she loaded her small stove and burned it hot for 3 hours, maintaining flames that brought interior temperature to 54 degrees by the door and 58 degrees near the stove. The Boulder's inner face grew warm, but never hot. At 9:55 that night, with outside temperature at 17 degrees, she banked the remaining coals and closed the damper. She did not maintain the fire. She allowed it to die completely. At 6:15 the next morning, 8 hours and 20 minutes after banking the fire, she took measurements. The stove was cold. Ashes showed no heat. Outside, temperature had dropped to 12 degrees. Inside, temperature measured 36 degrees by the door, 40 degrees at the stone bench where she slept. A 24-degree differential maintained through the coldest hours, with zero active heating. She placed her palm against the boulder. The stone felt noticeably warmer than surrounding air. The granite was releasing stored thermal energy, radiating it back into the living space. The physics were simple, though Karen did not think in scientific terms. Stone heats only because of its mass. The evening fire loaded thermal energy into perhaps 80,000 pounds of granite, warming the outer 6 to 12 inches of the boulder's inner face. That mass acted as a battery storing heat and releasing it gradually. The release rate was slower than wood stove output, but more consistent and longer lasting. The 3 log walls contained the heat more effectively than 4-wall construction that leaked energy in every direction. Karen's cabin lost heat through 3 surfaces and the roof. Standard cabins lost heat through 4 walls and roof, a 33% increase in surface area for thermal escape. 180 yards to the east, Silas Merrick's family experienced different mathematics. His cabin measured 12 by 16 feet with 4 exposed log walls. His craftsmanship was excellent, his chinking thorough. He had followed every principle his father taught. On that same night of December 18th, his wife Ingrid maintained their stove with the vigilance required for survival. She loaded split pine at 7 in the evening, achieving interior temperature of 48 degrees. At 10 o'clock, the stove burned steadily. At 2 in the morning, Ingrid woke to cold air on her face. She rose, added wood, returned to sleep. At 6:30, Silas took temperature measurements. Outside had dropped to 12 degrees. Inside measured 23 degrees, despite overnight fire maintenance. An 11-degree differential, half what Karen achieved with no overnight burning. The Merrick family burned fuel at approximately twice Karen's rate for inferior thermal performance. They consumed sleep. They consumed labor. They consumed wood they would need later. Silas noticed smoke no longer rose from Karen's chimney after 10 each evening. He assumed she was rationing dangerously. He mentioned this to Reverend Hale one Sunday. They agreed to check on the widow after Christmas. They did not consider that she might be managing better than they were. January brought sustained cold, 8 degrees below zero on 3 consecutive nights. Wind stripped heat from exposed walls. Snow accumulated to 8 feet in drifts. Karen's fuel consumption for December had totaled 1.2 cords of split pine. Neighbors averaged 2.1 cords. The differential suggested either dangerous cold or substantially greater efficiency. On January 12, 1881, Beatrice Harland made a visit. She had been hauling supplies and stopped under pretense of checking trail conditions. In reality, she wanted to see how the Norwegian widow was surviving. Karen invited her inside. The door opened onto interior air that felt noticeably warmer. Beatrice's cheeks stung from the transition. The cabin held perhaps 40 degrees. Water in a bucket near the door was liquid. The stove was cold. "You let your fire die," Beatrice said. "I bank it each night around 10. It dies by midnight." "How are you not frozen?" Karen gestured to the boulder. "Touch the stone." Beatrice crossed to the north wall. She placed her palm against the granite face. The rock felt warm, noticeably, measurably warmer than surrounding air. "It holds heat from the evening fire," Karen said quietly. "It releases slowly through the night. I sleep comfortably." Beatrice stood with her hand on the boulder for perhaps 30 seconds, feeling thermal energy radiating into her palm. Everything she believed about stone and construction and heat seemed suddenly uncertain. "How much wood are you burning?" "Approximately 1 cord per month." Beatrice had consumed 2 cords in 6 weeks. She was on pace to finish winter at 7 cords minimum. Karen would finish at 4 cords total. The implications were difficult to accept. Karen was warmer while burning half the fuel. The numbers suggested working with thermal mass reduced the punishing labor of constant wood cutting. Beatrice looked around the small cabin. She saw the temperature journal lying open on a table. She saw months of documented data. She did not examine the journal. She thanked Karen and stepped back into January cold that felt even more bitter after 20 minutes in the boulder-backed cabin. Driving home, she thought, what if the widow is right? What if everyone else is wrong? But admitting error meant consequences. It meant Silas Merrick and other men would question her expertise. It meant acknowledging she had been harsh in her initial judgment. It meant potential economic impact if others copied the method and needed less lumber. Beatrice told no one what she had felt in that cabin. She chose reputation over truth. She buried the knowledge like an uncomfortable secret and continued her winter as if nothing had changed. That choice would trouble her sleep for 2 years. By February 1883, it would nearly cost her daughter's life. February arrived and departed without crisis. The winter of 1880 to 1881 qualified as average for the Sierra Nevada. 15 to 20 feet of total snowfall. Night temperatures in the teens with occasional dips near zero. Difficult, but survivable. Karen finished the winter, having burned 3.8 cords of wood. Her neighbors averaged 6.5 cords. The differential was measurable and significant. The settlement's response was not acknowledgement. It was rationalization. When Ingrid Merrick mentioned the fuel consumption figures she had learned through conversation with other women, Silas offered immediate explanation. Miss Johansson's cabin faced south, sheltered from prevailing wind by terrain features. Her location provided natural protection. The savings resulted from site advantages, not design superiority. Others agreed. One mild winter proved nothing. The true test would come during exceptional cold. Reverend Hale preached a sermon in March about patience in judgment. He suggested, without naming Karen directly, that pride in appearing self-sufficient could blind people to vulnerability. Karen attended the service. She listened without comment. She understood the words were directed at her. She did not argue. Demonstration proved more effective than debate. She spent summer of 1881 improving her water collection system. She carved additional channels into the Boulder face, directing snowmelt and rainwater into her storage barrel. She split and stacked 5 cords of firewood, slightly more than the previous winter. She worked her garden plot. She tended chickens. She participated in community gatherings when invited, but did not force her presence. She lived quietly. She prepared methodically. The winter of 1881 to 1882 resembled the previous season. Average snowfall, average temperatures. Karen burned 4.1 cords. Neighbors averaged 6.8. The pattern held consistent. The data accumulated. Silas Merrick's sawmill business suffered slightly. 2 families who planned new structures asked Karen for advice on boulder-backed designs. Families who had not been present during initial mockery, who saw only fuel consumption data. Silas lost 20 logs of revenue per sale. His economic concern had proven accurate, even if his technical criticism had not. He did not confront Karen. He did not acknowledge publicly that his predictions about heat loss had failed to materialize. He continued operating his sawmill and privately wondered if he should modify his own cabin. By autumn of 1882, Karen had lived in her boulder-backed cabin for 23 months. She had documented thermal performance through 2 complete winters. She had proven efficiency that saved labor and provided superior comfort. The settlement had not acknowledged these facts publicly, but privately, in conversations between spouses, the truth circulated. The widow's method worked. The numbers did not lie. Then came the warning. September of 1882 brought signs that old-timers recognized. Squirrels cached double their normal food supplies. Elk descended from high country 3 weeks earlier than usual. Pine cones produced heavy seed crops. Daniel Iron Bear, a mixed Miwok and Scottish elder who had survived 78 years in the mountains, older even than Joseph Redwood, who had briefly advised Karen, stopped by Silas Merrick's sawmill in late September. The old man rarely made social visits. When he appeared, people listened. "Sky has colors, I remember, from before the Big Death," he said, referring to the winter of 1846 when starvation claimed dozens. "Clouds build wrong. Wind smells cold too early. This winter will be hard. Prepare more than you think you need." Silas thanked him. Some took it seriously and stacked extra wood. Others dismissed it as fearful memories of someone too old to assess present conditions accurately. Karen heard the warning through community gossip. She added another half-cord to her stockpile, bringing her total reserve to 4.5 cords. Her neighbors averaged 6 to 7 cords, believing this represented adequate preparation. By November of 1882, early snow had already deposited 3 feet around cabin foundations, double the accumulation typical for that date. Night temperatures dropped into single digits. The pattern suggested Daniel Ironbear's instincts had been correct. Freight wagons faced increasingly difficult conditions. Drivers reported drifts requiring teams of 8 oxen. Supply schedules stretched from weekly to uncertain. Families began rationing provisions and calculating fuel consumption with grim precision. December brought storms every 4 to 5 days, each delivering 2 to 3 feet of snow. Temperatures held brutally cold between systems. Men spent hours clearing roofs. Wood consumption accelerated beyond projected rates. Half a mile north of the main settlement, Ezra Thornton's crude shack began failing structurally. Wind found every gap in his hasty chinking. Interior temperatures barely rose above freezing, despite burning wood at rates that depleted his meager stockpile with alarming speed. He had prepared for average winter. This was not average. Near the southern trail, Widow Brennan faced similar mathematics. Her cabin's shallow roof pitch accumulated snow faster than she could clear it alone. Her children helped, but the work exceeded their strength. Inside, despite constant fire, temperatures hovered in the 20s. By January of 1883, it had become clear this winter matched the stories that old-timers told about seasons that killed. Karen burned fuel at the same steady rate, 1/8 cord per week. Consistent, predictable, sustainable even during exceptional cold. Her neighbors burned through reserves at accelerating rates. By the end of January, several families faced grim mathematics. Their remaining woodpiles suggested they would run out before spring. On January 18, 1882, Karen woke at dawn to find her cabin colder than usual, 32 degrees by the door. The stove had been out for 7 hours, but something felt wrong. She crossed to her water barrel. The surface showed ice. Not thick, but present. Her gravity-fed collection system had frozen during the coldest night yet. For 3 hours, she doubted. Had she miscalculated? Had the boulder's thermal mass reached its limit? Had her father's teachings failed in conditions more severe than Norwegian winters? She sat on the stone bench, pressing her palm to the boulder. The rock still held warmth, but less than usual. The night had been colder than any she had measured. Perhaps stone had limits after all. Then, dawn sun struck the granite's outer face. By 8 o'clock, she felt the boulder warming under her hand. By 10, she heard dripping. By noon, meltwater flowed into her collection barrel again. The stone was larger than any single night's cold. The thermal mass could absorb one exceptional night and recover with solar gain the next day. Her father had been right after all. She recorded the event in her journal with characteristic precision. January 18th, 1882. Outside, 15 degrees at dawn. Water barrel froze. Doubt arrived. Sun returned at 7:23 a.m. Boulder warmed. System recovered by 11:40 a.m. Stone is patient. Stone remembers warmth longer than cold remembers conquest. Father's promise holds. She never mentioned the incident to anyone, but the 3-hour period of doubt had taught her something valuable. Even sound principles faced moments that tested faith. Even thermal mass had limits during exceptional conditions. The question was whether those limits would be exceeded before winter ended. By the end of January, barometric pressure began to drop. Storm clouds built with distinctive patterns that Daniel Ironbear had recognized in September. Wind shifted to the north. The oldest settlers looked at the sky and felt fear. The final test was gathering strength over the northern peaks. Soon, it would arrive. Soon every assumption would face examination under conditions that permitted no margin for error. Karin Johansson sat in her three-walled cabin, recording temperatures, burning minimal fuel, sleeping warm on a stone bench that had recovered from its single night of doubt. The stone was ready, but in cabins throughout the settlement, people faced different mathematics. Silas Merrick's stockpile showed 1.8 cords remaining with 8 weeks of winter ahead. Beatrice Harlan's chimney still created backdraft whenever wind exceeded 40 miles per hour. Ezra Thornton had already burned through half his reserve. Widow Brennan's children huddled near a fire that barely kept interior temperature above freezing. The margin between survival and catastrophe was narrowing, and Karen, sitting alone in warmth that cost her almost nothing, understood what was coming. She had seen the other cabins' chimneys smoking at all hours. She had done the mathematics in her head. She had known with certainty, born from understanding physics rather than following tradition, that her neighbors' shelters would fail under sustained assault. She prepared her small space to accommodate refugees. She inventoried her food supplies. She calculated how many people the thermal mass could sustain. The answer was more than lived alone. Stone did not care how many bodies it warmed. It simply released what it had stored, patient and consistent, as the laws that governed its behavior. On February 1st, 1883, she added a final line to her journal before the storm arrived. Father, if you see, from wherever the dead watch the living, your teachings will save more than your daughter. Stone remembers warmth. Soon everyone will know. The next morning, the storm began. The storm arrived February 2nd, 1883, with a barometric pressure drop that made the settlement's single aneroid barometer fall like a stone thrown into a well. Wind began at dawn, building from 20 miles per hour to sustained gusts of 60 to 80 by mid-afternoon. Snow came not in flakes, but in horizontal curtains that reduced visibility to arm's length. Temperature plunged to 5 degrees Fahrenheit during daylight hours. By midnight of the first night, mercury showed 2 degrees below zero. By 3 in the morning of February 3rd, -5. The wind did not stop. The snow did not stop. The cold intensified with each passing hour. This was not average weather. This was exceptional severity that exceeded every assumption underlying cabin design, fuel stockpile, and margin for survival. Standard frontier construction revealed its limitations with speed that transformed inconvenience into genuine crisis within 48 hours. Silas Merrick's cabin began failing systematically. The chimney location on the windward side became a liability when sustained wind drove snow directly into the flue opening. Downdrafts pushed smoke back into living space, reducing combustion efficiency precisely when maximum heat was essential. Chinking between logs dried and cracked under repeated freeze-thaw cycles. Cold air infiltrated through seams that whistled audibly during wind gusts. The cabin sang with the high-pitched tone of air forced through narrow gaps at pressure. By February 4th, Silas measured interior temperature at 18 degrees at 6:20 in the morning, despite maintaining fire through the entire night. Outside temperature was -8. The differential was only 26 degrees. His wife, Ingrid, had not slept more than 2 hours consecutively since the storm began. She rose every 90 minutes to feed the stove burning split pine at rates that consumed nearly half a cord in 3 days. Their stockpile had diminished to 1.8 cords, with at least 8 weeks of winter remaining. The mathematics were simple and terrible. At current consumption, they would run out by late March. Cutting additional wood in current conditions was impossible. Wind chill approached -40 degrees. Visibility extended less than 10 feet. On the morning of February 5th, their son, Anders, woke with a cough that Ingrid recognized as dangerous. The 8-year-old's breathing came shallow and rapid. His lips carried blue-purple tinge, indicating poor circulation. Ingrid wrapped him in 3 wool blankets and placed him directly beside the stove. The boy shivered despite layers and proximity to heat. His fingers felt cold. His feet showed early signs of tissue damage despite never leaving the cabin. Their 12-year-old daughter, Greta, sat silent in a corner, old enough to understand danger, but young enough to feel powerless. She watched her mother feed the stove with mechanical precision, watched her father check, chinking, watched her brother struggle to breathe. At 3:15 in the morning on February 8th, the coldest moment of the entire storm, Silas stood beside his window, recording conditions by lantern light. Outside, temperature -12 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside, temperature 14 degrees. Water frozen solid 30 inches from hearth. Interior frost, half an inch thick on log faces. Anders's breathing labored. He looked across the cabin at his wife. Ingrid met his eyes. Neither spoke. Both understood. "We go to Miss Johansson," Ingrid said. Pride was a luxury. Their son's life was not negotiable. "At first light," Silas said. 100 yards to the south, Beatrice Harland faced different failures that produced equivalent crisis. Her chimney created backdraft that pushed smoke into the cabin whenever wind exceeded 40 miles per hour. The storm had sustained winds above that threshold for 6 consecutive days. She could not maintain adequate fire without filling the cabin with smoke that made breathing difficult and visibilities nearly impossible. She experimented with damping the fire to reduce smoke while accepting colder temperature. The compromise achieved nothing. Her 9-year-old daughter, Rose, developed a cough similar to Anders Merrick's. At 18 degrees interior, temperature, Rose's condition worsened. At 14 degrees, Beatrice made the same decision. They would go to the Boulder-backed cabin or watch their daughter sicken beyond recovery. 2 years of silence about what she had felt touching warm stone in January 1881 now felt like betrayal. She had known. She had felt the evidence. She had chosen reputation over truth. Now that choice might cost her daughter's life. Half a mile north, Ezra Thornton's shack simply became uninhabitable. Chinking collapsed. Interior temperature tracked within 5 degrees of outside readings. On February 6th, he abandoned it entirely. He wrapped himself in every blanket he owned and stumbled through waist-deep snow toward the main settlement. The journey of half a mile took nearly an hour. He arrived at Widow Brennan's cabin, pounded on the door, collapsed inside. When she opened it, the widow's cabin, while struggling, still provided marginal protection. Her roof sagged under snow load, but had not yet failed. Her fire produced some heat, despite inadequate fuel reserves. She took in the bachelor miner because frontier code demanded it even when resources were desperately scarce. Now, 5 people crowded into her small space, 2 adults and 4 children, burning through her remaining cord of wood with terrifying speed. While her neighbors fought losing battles, Karin Johansson's cabin performed exactly as physics predicted. Snowdrifts accumulated 4 to 5 feet high against the granite's base, creating natural insulation. The steep roof shed snow loads cleanly. The 3 log walls contained stored heat more effectively than 4-wall construction. Her evening routine remained unchanged. She burned the stove hot from supper until 10 o'clock, loading split pine that brought interior temperature to 60 degrees near the stove and 54 degrees by the door. The boulder's inner face absorbed thermal energy into mass that would release it gradually. At 10 o'clock, she banked the coals and closed the damper. She allowed the fire to die naturally. On the night of February 7th to 8th, the coldest 24 hours of the entire winter, Karen documented performance that vindicated every design decision. 7 o'clock evening, stove burning hot for 3 hours. Interior 62 degrees near stove, 54 degrees by door, outside 2 degrees. Wind sustained at 55 miles per hour. 9:45. Stove banked to coals. Interior 58 degrees near stove, 51 degrees by door. Boulder face warm to bare palm. 3:15 in the morning, February 8th, peak cold. Outside -12 degrees. Stove completely cold for more than 5 hours. Interior temperature 44 degrees by the door, 48 degrees at the stone bench. Differential of 56 to 60 degrees. Maintained with 0 active heating. Water in her barrel remained liquid. No frost formed on interior walls. She breathed easy in air that felt cool but not dangerous. She slept comfortably on stone that radiated stored warmth. Her fuel consumption for the first 8 days totaled 0.3 cords. 9 days of brutal cold, addressed with steady burning pattern. At 6:30 on the morning of February 9th, she recorded her daily measurements and added a single line: "Storm continues. Stone performs, as Father promised. They will come today." She had known this moment would arrive. She had prepared for it. She boiled water from her gravity system. She arranged sleeping areas on the floor and stone bench. She waited. At 7:45 in the morning, Silas Merrick made his decision final. He had spent the night watching Anders' condition worsen. The boy's breathing had grown more labored. His color had paled further. Another night in 14-degree air would kill him. Silas stepped outside into wind that stole breath from lungs. He cupped his hands and shouted toward Beatrice Harlan's cabin, barely visible through blowing snow. "Beatrice, we're going to Johansson's." A moment later, her door opened. She shouted back, "Rose is sick. We're coming too." From the south, faintly, another voice. Widow Brennan had heard the exchange. "We can't last another night. 5 of us coming." The storm had compressed the settlement into a single, desperate decision made by separate families at the same desperate hour. The journey from Silas Merrick's cabin to Karen's shelter covered 180 yards, a walk of 2 minutes in normal conditions. In waist-deep snow, with wind chill at -30 degrees, it transformed into Odyssey, requiring 35 minutes of physical effort, approaching the limits of endurance. Silas led his family using rope tied between them. Ingrid carried Anders wrapped in blankets. Greta followed, holding her mother's coat. They moved in single file, Silas breaking trail through drifts that filled behind them within seconds. Beatrice Harland and Rose joined them 20 yards into the journey, appearing like ghosts. Widow Brennan's group added to the column herself, Ezra Thornton and her 3 children. 11 people total moving as one unit because separation meant death. They expected to find interior conditions marginally better, perhaps 30 degrees instead of 15, perhaps enough improvement to survive a few more days. Karen opened the door to 42-degree air that struck their frozen faces like summer warmth. Heat radiated from the north wall despite no visible fire, no smoke, no active heating. Silas Merrick stepped across the threshold and felt his certainty collapse. 2 years of rationalization dissolved in the face of warmth that could not be explained by site location or luck. "How is there no fire burning?" His voice cracked. "The stone," Karen said quietly. "Come inside quickly. Cold follows open doors." She directed them efficiently. Anders Merrick went immediately to the stone bench. Rose Harland received the second-best position. Children and elderly placed where heat concentrated. Adults assigned floor space near the door. Karen boiled water for pine needle tea. She shared her food stores without calculation or resentment. She allocated sleeping areas with practical logistics of someone managing survival rather than hosting guests. 11 people crowded into space designed for one. The cabin should have been overwhelmed. Instead, the thermal mass system continued functioning exactly as designed. The added body heat contributed to the thermal load. The Boulder absorbed the excess and moderated temperature swings. The cabin remained comfortable through the night, warmer with refugees than it had been with only Karen. But at 2:30 in the morning, on February 10th, Silas woke to a sound that sent fear through his chest. A sharp crack, like a rifle shot, echoed through the cabin. People jolted awake. Someone screamed. In the darkness, with 11 people crowded together, panic spread instantly. "The Boulder!" Beatrice Harlan's voice shrill with fear. "It's splitting!" Silas scrambled for his lantern, struck a match. Light revealed everyone sitting up, eyes wide. Karen alone remained calm. She rose from her sleeping position, crossed to the north wall, placed her palm against the granite face. "Everyone be still," she said. "That sound," Silas began, "was the Boulder contracting. Thermal stress. Rock expands when heated contracts, when cooled. Sometimes it makes noise. But if it splits," Beatrice started. Karen moved her lantern along the boulder's face, examining the surface carefully. "There, do you see a hairline crack no wider than a thread, ran perhaps 8 inches up from the floor? Superficial, surface stress only." "This crack has been here for years," Karen said calmly. "Possibly decades. The cold makes it speak, that's all. The Boulder is not failing. It's adjusting. Stone does this." She pressed her palm to the granite on both sides of the crack. "Feel it. Still warm, still releasing heat, still keeping us alive." Silas crossed to the wall. He placed his own hand on the stone. The rock felt solid, warm, unchanged, despite the noise that had terrified everyone. "My father taught me to listen to stone," Karen said, her voice carrying the weight of knowledge earned through observation. "Cracking sounds frightening, but a true structural failure sounds different, deeper, like thunder instead of rifle shot." This was surface stress, nothing more. She returned to her sleeping area. "The Boulder has stood here longer than white men have been in California, longer than the Miwok who came before. It will stand longer than any of us live. Sleep. We're safe." Gradually, heartbeats slowed. People settled back to floor and bench. But the moment had reminded everyone how completely their survival depended on the stone wall that one woman had trusted when no one else would. At 6:15, the morning of February 10th, Silas woke to 46-degree interior temperature. The stove had not been lit since the previous evening. His son Anders slept peacefully on the stone bench, his breathing easier, his color improved. Silas crossed to the boulder. He placed his bare palm against the granite face, feeling warmth radiate into his skin. "I was wrong, Miss Johansson," he said. "Completely dangerously wrong. You tried to tell us. We wouldn't listen." Karen looked up from her journal, where she was recording morning temperature data. "You were careful. That is wisdom. Now you understand stone. Now you can build better. When spring comes, I'm rebuilding. Will you teach me?" "Yes, and anyone else who asks." Beatrice Harland, overhearing from across the cabin, spoke the question that had troubled her for 2 years. "Why didn't you argue with us before? Why didn't you insist we were wrong?" Karen set down her pencil. She looked at the 11 people crowded into her shelter, all of them warm, despite the storm still raging outside, all of them alive, because granite remembered heat. "Stone argues better than words," she said. "You needed to feel warmth to believe. Now you have felt it. Now you know." She paused, then added something she had never spoken aloud. "My husband Eric died in darkness and cold, crushed in a mine shaft where stone trapped instead of protected. For months, I wondered if I could trust rock at all. Then I remembered my father's teaching. Stone is not good or evil. It simply is. It holds whatever we give it, cold or warmth, death or life. The choice is ours." The cabin fell silent. For the first time, her neighbors understood. This was not about proving anyone wrong. This was about honoring a father's wisdom, and perhaps redeeming a husband's death by ensuring stone saved lives instead of taking them. The storm broke on February 14th. 7 days later, on a clear morning when outside temperature climbed to 20 degrees, the settlement gathered for community reckoning. 19 people sat in the main gathering cabin, every adult in the valley. Silas Merrick stood first. He was not comfortable with public admission of error, but expertise meant nothing measured against his son's blue-tinged lips and Karen's warm stone bench. "I told Miss Johansson her cabin would fail," he said. "I was wrong. The thermal mass design works. It works better than standard construction." He presented fuel consumption data. Karen had burned 4.2 cords total. Families with standard cabins had consumed 8 to 9 cords, several burning furniture and tool handles when stockpiles ran low. "I'm rebuilding my cabin," Silas continued. 3 walls with a smaller boulder I've identified 300 yards from my current site. I'm asking Miss Johansson to consult. I'll pay her in labor materials, in public acknowledgement that her method saved my son's life. Beatrice Harland spoke next, her voice carrying the weight of 2 years of buried truth. "I visited Miss Johansson's cabin in January of 1881. I touched the warm boulder. I felt the 40-degree air with no fire burning. I knew then that her method worked, but I told no one. I chose my reputation over truth. That choice nearly killed my daughter." She looked directly at Karen. "I'm sorry. For doubting you, yes, but more for knowing you were right and staying silent about it. That was cowardice." Karen met her eyes. "You're speaking now. That's what matters." Beatrice described her plan to retrofit her cabin by building a 2-foot thick stone wall behind her stove. The project would require moving approximately 1,500 pounds of rock. She considered the labor worthwhile. Over the following 2 hours, 9 families committed to modifications, incorporating thermal mass principles. Some would rebuild completely. Others would retrofit. Widow Brennan, who had nearly lost her children, committed to relocating her cabin against a rock outcrop she had previously considered an obstacle. "I thought it was bad luck having that stone on my land. Turns out it was the best luck I never recognized." Even Ezra Thornton, the solitary bachelor, spoke briefly. "I'll help anyone who needs labor. I owe 11 people my life. Working their stone walls is the least I can do." Reverend Hale offered what qualified as apology from a man who rarely admitted error. "I preached patience in judgment. I should have practiced it better myself. Miss Johansson's work deserves respect, not suspicion." When the meeting turned to practical instruction, Karen rose and moved to a slate board. She drew diagrams showing boulder placement, stove positioning, bench construction. She explained thermal mass principles in folk language. Stone heats slow, stone cools slow, like banked coals that release warmth for hours. Evening fire loads heat into rock. Rock gives back through the night. 3 walls lose less heat than 4. Snow against the boulder acts like wool blanket. These are not mysteries. These are simple facts about how materials behave. She answered questions for 3 hours. She sketched plans for individual families. She asked for no payment beyond what people chose to offer. When someone asked why she had never insisted they listen, before the crisis, she said simply, "Words don't convince. Experience convinces. You needed to feel stone's warmth to believe. Now you believe." Spring of 1883 transformed the settlement's approach to construction. By June 5, families had begun rebuilding with rock-backed designs. By September 9, cabins incorporated significant thermal mass. Silas Merrick's new kitchen addition became the valley's second 3-wall structure, an immediate proof that the principle scaled to different applications. He had found a granite outcrop 8 feet high and 12 feet long, smaller than Karen's boulder, but adequate. His fuel consumption for winter 1883 to 1884 dropped 38% compared to his old cabin. Beatrice Harlan's retrofit installation proved equally successful. Her fuel consumption dropped 32%. Her cabin maintained 5 to 8 degrees higher interior temperature at dawn, despite identical heating patterns. The settlement's collective firewood consumption dropped from 28 cords during the crisis winter to projected 19 cords for normal conditions. The reduction represented $180 in saved labor across 18 families, significant savings in an economy where cash remained scarce. Word spread through the network of trails and freight routes. Other communities heard about the Norwegian widow's thermal mass method. Miners adapted the principles to dugout boulder combinations. Families in 6 Sierra Nevada settlements within 50 miles implemented rock-backed designs between 1884 and 1890. Local newspapers ran brief articles about Johansson's thermal technique. The coverage remained local and practical. These were working families documenting working solutions. The innovation spread through demonstration and results rather than promotion. Karen continued living in her boulder-backed cabin, recording temperatures, refining techniques, teaching anyone who asked. She never charged fees. She never claimed invention. She simply shared knowledge her father had taught her. In 1920, building scientists began formalizing the physics underlying frontier observations about thermal mass. Research documented that dense materials with high specific heat capacity could store significant thermal energy and release it gradually. Government energy efficiency guides, published in the 1940s, recommended exactly the techniques Karen had employed 60 years earlier. stone or masonry walls, passive solar orientation, strategic thermal mass placement. Modern passive solar design continues incorporating lessons that Karen learned through necessity and observation. Contemporary energy-efficient housing uses the same physics she understood through her father's teachings. Karen Johansson lived in her three-walled cabin until 1908, when declining health prompted her move to town, where medical care was more accessible. She died in 1911 at age 67, having never remarried, having lived simply, keeping chickens, and recording temperatures until the end. The cabin stood for another 33 years, used by various families who appreciated its superior climate control and minimal fuel requirements. Fire destroyed the structure in 1944. The Boulder remains, a 20-foot granite monument to observation, over tradition to physics, over pride to one woman's quiet insistence that stone remembers warmth better than men remember being wrong. Her temperature journal, preserved in a small museum in the valley below, contains an entry from February 8, 1883, outside -12 degrees Fahrenheit, inside 44 degrees, fire extinguished 5 hours, stone warm as father's hearth, 11 souls protected, his teachings live. Eric, I hope, wherever you rest in darkness, you know stone saved lives instead of taking them. Stone remembers warmth, my love. Stone remembers. Survival in the American West belonged to those who observed nature, tested methods without ego, and shared knowledge freely. Karen Johansson's Boulder stood testament to that principle for 3 generations. The stone remains warming, nothing now but memory, proving still that some truths outlast the structures built to demonstrate them.